I noticed. I kept quiet. That was the part nobody ever understood about me, the keeping quiet. It was a Tuesday when I found out. Not some dramatic Friday night, not a holiday. A Tuesday in March, when the light comes in flat and gray, and the coffee is never quite hot enough. I'd come home early because a meeting got canceled, and I walked into my own kitchen to find my wife on the phone, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in 2 years. She didn't hear me come in. I stood in the hallway for maybe 30 seconds, long enough to hear her say his name, her boss, and the way she said it told me everything I needed to know. I went back outside, sat in my car in the driveway, let the engine idle. That was the day I started paying attention. My wife and I had been married 11 years. We met when I was 28 and she was 25 at a friend's backyard cookout where she'd shown up in a blue dress and argued passionately with a stranger about whether a hot dog was a sandwich. I'd liked her immediately. That version of her, stubborn, funny, completely unself-conscious, had been the woman I fell in love with. Somewhere in the last few years, she'd become someone who checked her phone under the dinner table and came home from work events smelling like someone else's cologne. I was a structural engineer, 41 years old. Not the kind of man who makes scenes. My father never made scenes. His father never made scenes. We were the kind of men who looked at a problem, assessed the load-bearing points, and found the most efficient way to address it. So that's what I did. I did not confront her. I did not look through her phone. I did not call her best friend, or her mother, or any of the people I might have called. Instead, I started paying attention to the architecture of our marriage. What was still standing? What had quietly collapsed? What I had failed to notice, because I was always at the office, or in the garage, or somewhere else pretending that a quiet house was the same thing as a peaceful one. Her boss was named Maxwell. I'd met him twice, once at a company holiday party 3 years earlier, and once when I dropped off her laptop at his office. He was the kind of man who took up space on purpose. Not tall, but broad. The kind of handshake that lasts a half second too long. He ran a commercial real estate firm that had done well in the past decade. The kind of well that gets your photo in regional business magazines and makes you believe you are fundamentally different from other people. He was 53, married with 2 kids who were already in college. I knew his wife's name because I'd looked it up. Adrian had been mentioned in one of those magazine profiles. A small caption under a photo from a charity gala. Her in a dark green dress, not quite smiling. The article described her as a landscape architect who had stepped back from her career to raise their children. I had looked at that photo for a long time. There's a particular kind of woman who gets described that way. Stepped back, as if it were a choice made freely, in a well-lit room, with full information. I had no idea what Adrian's actual story was, but I recognized something in her expression. The careful neutrality of someone who has learned not to expect much from the room she's in. I started running in the mornings. I'd always meant to, the way people always mean to. But that March, I started waking up at 5:30 and going out before the neighborhood stirred, and I discovered that the neighborhood had a whole, quiet life I'd never seen. There was a man 2 streets over who walked his ancient golden retriever in the dark, a woman who sat on her porch with coffee before the sun came up, and on Wednesdays, at the park near the elementary school, a farmer's market set up just as the light turned gold. I was at that market on a Wednesday in April when I first ran into Adrian. I recognized her from the photo. She was standing at a flower stand, turning a bunch of pale yellow tulips in her hands the way someone does when they're not really looking at the thing they're holding. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and a gray jacket that looked like it had been expensive once. Her hair was shorter than in the magazine photo. I didn't approach her. I bought a bag of coffee and went home. The following Wednesday, I went back. She was there again at the same flower stand. This time I was close enough to see that her eyes were red around the edges, the specific red of someone who has cried recently and is now very focused on not crying again. I said good morning. She said good morning back. I asked if she grew her own or if she bought them here. She looked at me for a second like the question surprised her. I used to grow my own, she said. My garden has gotten away from me lately. I said I understood the feeling. That was it. We went our separate ways. But the following Wednesday, I was there again. And so was she. And this time we ended up walking in the same direction by accident and then by choice. past the bread stall, and the honey vendor, and the woman who sold miniature succulents in ceramic pots. We talked about gardens. She had studied landscape architecture at a school in North Carolina. She talked about soil composition the way I talked about load distribution, with a precision that came from genuine love for the subject. I listened to her more carefully than I had listened to anyone in a long time. I did not tell her. My wife worked for her husband. I did not tell her anything about any of it. There was nothing to tell yet. We were just two people at a farmer's market talking about soil. In May, my wife started staying later at the office. The excuses were reasonable. A big development project, a client in from out of town, the usual textures of a plausible lie. I stopped questioning them. I had stopped questioning them in March, actually. There is a difference between not knowing and choosing your next move carefully. And by May, I was firmly in the second category. I also, by May, had begun to understand that my marriage had been over for longer than I wanted to admit. Not because of her boss, because of us, the distance that had grown between two people who had stopped tending to what they had. I was not blameless. I knew that. I had worked too much and assumed too much, and somewhere along the way had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of connection. But understanding your own culpability doesn't mean you have to accept betrayal as the outcome. Those are two different things. The Wednesday in late May, when everything shifted, it was raining lightly. Adrian was at the market anyway, under a canvas umbrella the vendor had set up, and she had a sketchbook with her. She was drawing the arrangement of a flower stall from memory, not from looking at it. I asked if I could see. She hesitated, then turned it toward me. It was detailed in a way I hadn't expected. Not a sketch, more like a study. The proportions were exact, but what struck me was what she'd chosen to include and what she'd left out. She'd omitted the price signs, the card reader, the vendor's face. What remained was pure form. Petals, stems, shadow. Why leave out the faces? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Sometimes the most important things are what you choose not to put in, she said. The space around something defines it as much as the thing itself. I thought about that for a long time afterward. About my marriage, about the spaces I hadn't noticed emptying out, about the version of my life I had been so certain I was living. June arrived. My wife was by then barely pretending. She came home distracted, left early, texted at dinner. I documented nothing. I am not a man who documents. What I did was make a decision that I would not destroy my own life in the process of watching her destroy hers. That whatever came next, I would handle it without losing myself in it. I called a lawyer on the 2nd of June. Not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A friend who had become a family law attorney, someone I trusted. I told him where things stood. He told me what to know and what to keep. I listened. What I did not know in June was that Maxwell was stealing from his own firm. I found out the way you find out most things that are none of your business, by accident from a distance. A friend of mine worked at a commercial bank downtown. We had lunch the way we did a few times a year, and he mentioned, in the careful, non-specific way, that people mention things they're not supposed to mention, that there was a commercial real estate firm whose accounts looked like someone had been using the operating fund as a personal slush pool for close to 18 months. He didn't name the firm. He didn't have to. I did the math. I looked up the timing. I sat with the information. I didn't do anything with it. Not then. There was nothing I needed to do. Something like that doesn't stay hidden. Renfield Health. You can reroute money for a while, but the architecture of financial fraud has load-bearing points just like any other structure, and they fail in sequence when the weight gets to be too much. The farmer's market ran through October, and by July, Adrian and I had become something I didn't have a clean word for. Not friends exactly, not anything else. We met on Wednesdays and talked about things that had nothing to do with either of our actual lives. About a book I was reading on Byzantine construction techniques. About a garden she was designing pro bono for a community center. About the difference between restoration and renovation and why it mattered. She was the most intellectually honest person I had met in years. She said what she thought. She admitted what she didn't know. When something was difficult, she said it was difficult. There was no performance to her. I was in love with her by August. I knew it the way you know structural failure is coming. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small signs that you stop being able to ignore. I did nothing about it. There was nothing to do. She was married, and so was I, and some situations require patience rather than action. What changed things was not anything I planned. My wife told me in August that she wanted a divorce. She did not say why. She did not mention Maxwell. She was civil about it, in the way that people are civil when they have already made all their decisions and just need you to agree. I told her I would talk to my lawyer. She seemed surprised that I had one already. The papers were filed at the end of August. Maxwell found out that September. Not about the divorce specifically, about the audit. The firm's outside accountant had flagged discrepancies going back 14 months. The number, from what I heard through the same quiet channels, through which I'd heard everything else, was significant. Not catastrophic, not yet, but significant enough that questions were being asked. And answers were coming up short. I heard all of this at a distance, the way you hear thunder before the storm arrives. What I did not expect was to hear from Adrian directly. Well, she called me a Thursday in September. She had my number from a message chain about a community garden event we'd both attended. Her voice on the phone was the steadiest I'd ever heard it, which meant it was very close to breaking. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to already know that I'm not asking anything of you. I just need to say it to someone who isn't going to perform a reaction. I said, okay, I know who your wife is, she said. I've known since June. I sat down. She told me she had figured it out on her own. A last name on a document on her husband's desk. She hadn't said anything because she hadn't known what to say, because she had been, in her words, trying to decide what kind of person I am in a situation like this. I asked what she had decided. That I am someone who files for divorce, she said, which I am doing on Monday. I told her I had already done the same. She was quiet for a moment. Well, she said, that's one thing then. We did not rush anything after that. I want to be clear about that because it matters, not to justify ourselves, but because it was genuinely true. There was grief to move through first. Hers and mine both. Grief over marriages that had lasted longer than they should have, over time and effort invested in things that had quietly stopped being what we thought they were. You don't skip that part. You shouldn't. The people who skip that part show up to the next thing, carrying everything they refuse to put down. I spent the fall in the house I'd lived in for 8 years, slowly recognizing how much of it had never felt like mine. The furniture we'd chosen together in a showroom on a rainy Saturday. The kitchen layout I had always found inefficient but never said so. The specific silence of a house where two people stopped talking to each other. My wife and Maxwell ended in November. I know this because my lawyer mentioned it in passing, the way lawyers mention things that are relevant without being their business. He had his own complications to deal with by then. The financial audit had expanded. There were creditors asking questions. The man whose firm had grown his face into regional business magazines was now someone whose accountant wouldn't return calls. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be honest about that too. What I felt was something closer to recognition. That this was the architecture of the choices he had made, leads settling at last, under its own weight. Adrian and I had coffee in October, then dinner in November, then somewhere in December, stopped counting what number we were on. She brought her sketchbook to dinner once, and showed me a design she was working on. A rooftop garden for a mixed-use building downtown. Native plants, grasses that moved in the wind. She explained how the weight distribution had to be calculated, how you could not simply impose a garden on a structure that wasn't built to hold it. You have to work with the load-bearing capacity that already exists, she said. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. There is a version of this story where I am the villain, where I am a man who moved on another man's wife while my own marriage was failing. I understand why someone might read it that way. People look for the clean moral categories because the complicated ones are harder to hold. What I know is this. I did not pursue Adrian to hurt Maxwell. I did not pursue her at all, in the conventional sense. I showed up on Wednesday mornings to a farmer's market and talked to a woman who was worth talking to, and everything else followed from that. The heart does not consult a calendar before it moves. What matters is what you do when you recognize what's happening, whether you act with integrity in the aftermath, whether you are honest about your own part in things, whether you show up to what's next with your hands actually empty. My ex-wife and I have not spoken since December, except through lawyers. I don't hold bitterness about it. I hold some sadness. The way you hold the specific sadness of a thing that could have been different, if different choices had been made by different people, including yourself. I made choices too much. I assumed too much. I let the quiet house convince me we were fine. Adrian's divorce was finalized in February. Mine in March, almost exactly 1 year after I'd stood in the hallway of my own house, listening to my wife laugh. It is April now. The farmer's market has opened again for the season. We went this morning, the two of us, and she bought tulips. Yellow ones. The same color as the first time I saw her. I carried the coffee. We walked back through the neighborhood in the early light, and she talked about a red maple she wanted to plant in the yard of the house she's renting. Something with deep roots. Something built to last. I listened. I thought about how some structures hold because they were designed well from the beginning, and some hold because the people inside them decided, every day, to keep tending to what they had built. I think we are going to tend to this one very carefully.